Okay, good morning, everyone. John, thank you so much for organizing this and for inviting us, inviting me as well. Thank you so much to the Watson Institute, the Urban Institute, Ivy, Chloe, and everyone who has made this day possible. Okay, so exciting panel. So I'm going to go in the order of the program, and then I'm going to invite, I'll do one person at a time, right, sorry. So we will start with Brooklyn Hitchens, who is an assistant professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And the clicker, this thing here, right? Can I just make sure? Is it just the center? Okay, all right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brooklyn Hitchens, and I'm an assistant professor in criminology and criminal justice at the University of Maryland. I'm a sociologist by training and a critical criminologist who studies the complex lived experiences of low-income Black communities with issues such as gun violence and policing. So I zero in on how inequities in race, class, and gender shape their participation in crime, risk for victimization, and involvement with the criminal legal system. So this work today will hopefully lead us into a discussion on how we as researchers can do a better job at working with the criminalized populations we study. So I offer a methodological framework first created by Dr. Yasser Payne called Street Participatory Action Research, or Street PAR, to engage the streets of Black America. By the streets, I mean the disproportionately hard to reach subgroup of low-income Black populations that understand criminal behavior as an adaptive response to adverse structural conditions. So folks, caught in illegal activities, bonding activities, those incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and those who face various levels of structural precarity. And I've worked with street-identified Black populations in cities like Wilmington, Delaware, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and Brooklyn, New York for the last 14 years. So two overarching questions that focus my talk on community engaged methods are: how do we manage the social value of our research and obligations to research participants? And how do we leverage our research findings towards community programming, activism, and or grassroots organizing, right? So to what do we owe the people who lend us their stories, their data, their trauma, their suffering, but also their resilience? Research is inherently extractive, but there are things we can do to mitigate harm and add to the communities that we study. So one answer I offer is PAR, Participatory Action Research. PAR is a long-standing methodological tradition that spans education, psychology, anthropology, public health, etc., and prioritizes including members of the population of interest onto the research team. And this can be any target population, right? From homeless youth to reproductive activists to single mothers. Critical to PAR, though, is that these team members are included in all phases of the research process, from project design, questions, theoretical framing, methods analysis, co-authorship, and conference presentations. Street PAR is a more aggressive iteration of PAR and trains street-identified and or formerly incarcerated persons to do activism and empirically document the lived experiences of other street-identified populations. PAR requires a social justice response. That is research that intentionally addresses, or at least works to address, the social inequalities that participants experience within the research process, but also in their everyday lives. But the field of criminology has been slow to adopt more emancipatory, participatory, and translational research models when engaging with marginalized populations. There are a lot of reasons for this, which some of we can probably guess, but part of it is due to difficulties in accessing justice-involved or captive populations, as we sometimes call them. But the more uncomfortable truth is that many of us, even sometimes the well-meaning ones, struggle with seeing the value or practicality of including these folks in the research process. Oftentimes, sometimes even in our pseudo attempts at objectivity, which we can talk more about. PAR then is indeed an epistemological shift in the location of power and knowledge. So how do we do it? What does this look like in practice? Street PAR prioritizes bringing the doctoral model to the street corner. That means training street-identified populations similar to how we train our doc students. Classroom, workshop-style trainings, that meet multiple times a week. For example, on one recent PAR project, we met 3 to 4 times a week for 3 to 4 hours per session in a local community center. Street PAR members completed 18 research workshops with a focus on critical theories, methods, analysis, and activism. So we teach them sampling. We teach them regression. We teach them qualitative methods. And we don't really water down those trainings because we believe that they can learn too. And we do all of this to get folks ready for on-the-ground data collection. We task our street PAR team with collecting large quantitative and qualitative samples of hard-to-reach Black populations. So folks who researchers notoriously struggle to engage due to legacies of mistrust and mistreatment, which we're all aware of. PAR projects are strengthened by the social capital, the credibility, and the skill sets of the street PAR team. And we gathered this population and we asked them a myriad of questions on policing, on violence, health, incarceration, housing. So here's a snapshot from a 45-page survey instrument we administered to over 700 street-identified Black folks in Wilmington, Delaware. As a PAR team, we also meet regularly for data meetings where we check in, we troubleshoot, and we update one another on the project goals and timeline. Central to the street PAR model is action or activism. And I've witnessed, firsthand how an empowered community ignites critical social change in their neighborhoods. So street PAR team members use the research skill set they've gained or garnered to enact criminal justice reform with the ACLU, to become violence interrupters who, settle disputes, and present study findings on academic panels. So associates are able to enhance their resume with professional experiences gleaned from the project, and then use those experiences to ensure quality employment and educational opportunities. So they wield the power of research, the power that we all know very well, to transform their lives and the lives of their community. So for example, on this bottom left photo is Jonathan, affectionately known as Run. So if Run were here, he'd tell you he was the problem, is something he'd say. He struggled with addiction for a long time, and he was actually shot on 3 different occasions. So on the 3rd time that he was shot, he became, paralyzed from the waist down. But Jonathan used the street PAR model to effectively transform his life. So he not only went back and got his doctorate, he runs a successful nonprofit in Southwest Philadelphia, and I work closely with Dr. Wilson on engaging youth in the city of Philadelphia who carry guns. Street PAR operates from a resilience framework. that recognizes the phenomenological experiences of low-income Black populations in tandem with violent sociostructural conditions and how those two together create street life. So Street PAR sees crime as resilience, or how street-identified persons or groups organize meaning around feeling well, satisfied, or accomplished, and how they choose to survive in relation to adverse structural conditions. So we prioritize their language and cultural worldview to do research differently. We also work to mitigate the extractive nature of research by providing the PAR team with a research skill set and a livable wage. How else do we intend to help folks transition from the streets or the criminal legal system if we don't pay them their worth and aid in their upward mobility? So we pay our team anywhere from $20 to $30 an hour, and we also pay our study participants anywhere from $30 to $70 for their participation. We also have open discussions about the allocation of resources. How often are we transparent with our participants about how much money, capital, and acclaim we achieve from their labor? So we discuss how our funding dollars are divvied up right from the onset, and we have honest conversations about the budget, the resources, and the incentives. So Street PAR engages the target population in the social justice process and gives the community control of how their data are accessed, collected, analyzed, and disseminated. And as a result, we believe that we gain culturally competent data that bolsters our conversation on carceral systems. And so with Street PAR, we recognize that abolition and decarceration is a long game. We push our local and state government towards criminal justice reform, most recently with a compassionate release bill that passed in the Delaware Senate. So we know, right, we're carceral scholars here. We know nationwide that we have a significant portion of older and infirmed incarcerated folks who are literally wasting their lives away in jail cells or prison cells. Black men make up over 57% of those imprisoned in Delaware for 30 years or more. And so with compassionate release, those long imprisoned folks have the opportunity to petition before a parole board and have their sentences reduced due to medical and/or age-related reasons. We also make a case for a community-led IRB, which will allow marginalized groups to effectively control and protect the data extracted from their communities. So that includes researchers, politicians, and the media. And finally, we implore researchers to examine violence, to examine carcerality and harm in relation to the racial ethnic wealth gap. We advocate for a robust, comprehensive Black reparations plan as one of the only interventions that can realistically counter the legacy of structural violence and concentrated disadvantage that then leads to street life in Black America. So I think I'm a little early, and I will end there. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Our next speaker is Shannon Malone Gonzalez, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Thank you for having me here today to talk about my research, but in particular to reflect upon my research process and the implications of that process for how we understand and measure police violence against Black women and girls. And I want to say that I really appreciated the opportunity to listen to folks yesterday and really this framing and thinking about abolition as a process, as a praxis, one that we can incorporate into our methods. And my work really looks at this process, both punishment processes, but also resistance, and what it means to include and exclude Black women from these processes of punishment and policies to address it. First, I'm going to give a brief overview, hopefully brief, of my project and the conditions faced when thinking about how we conceptualize police violence. specifically thinking about what does it mean to investigate experiences with police that are often rendered invisible in our data. Importantly, I'm not the first to think deeply about the invisibility surrounding Black women and girls' encounters with police. There's a long history of Black women, feminist scholars and activists speaking to this invisibility and working to undo it and promote safe conditions for Black women and girls, such as Kimberly Crenshaw, Andrea Ritchie, Treva Lindsay, Nicole Burrows, and many, many other activists and scholars. Yet, this invisibility persists. And in 2020, during the midst of the uprisings and heightened attention to policing, many were still pushing back against the invisibility around Black women and girls' police encounters, calling out the ways they were excluded in our understandings of victims. But also, I'm going to talk about today how we exclude them in our policies by limiting conceptualizations of police violence to traffic or pedestrian stops, despite research and reports that show that Black women and girls encounter officers in other locations, as well as exclude police gender-based and sexual violences in our measurements. When thinking about and challenging how we investigate the invisible, or experiences on the margins of dominant conceptualizations of policing and violence, we have to understand how conditions of punishment that create the possibilities for violence are linked to and are very much the same conditions that determine how we create knowledge and definitions of violence. Thus, understanding and taking seriously epistemic violence is really important for investigating experiences rendered invisible. And here, I really like Christy Dotson's understanding of epistemic violence because it gets us to place the emphasis on the role of the listener, be they the person, the institution, or the policymakers, and the conditions that obfuscate Black women and girls' encounters. Here, she defines epistemic violence as a failure on the part of the listener to reciprocate communication and acknowledge or respond to the experience. More, she outlines how Black women's testimonies about their experiences become quieted or smothered through the inability to recognize Black women as legitimate knowledge producers, even when it comes to their own experiences, and how Black women then adjust the telling of their stories because they feel unsafe, again nodding to the link and conditions of disclosure to the conditions of violence. And last, the ways Black women recognize that others don't have the tools or frames then to understand their stories. Now, I argue in my work that this has real implications for how we have historically and continue to operationalize and measure police violence, make claims about its prevalence, and ultimately how these claims dictate our policies. In thinking about the barriers and accounting for Black women and girls' experiences with police, our databases and surveys that are often used to document violence, we have to think about the role of epistemic violence at every single level. Structurally, we have to account for how marginalized groups have historically been excluded from knowledge production processes and institutions, including research institutions and media, places that often determine which stories matter and which ones don't on our national stages. And in the absence of mandatory reporting of police violence from police departments in the United States, citizen groups, activists, and journalists have been filling in this structural gap by collating media and survivor reports to document encounters. However, there is limited demographic information and limited information on police gender-based and sexual violence, leading to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing to call for federal agencies to start collecting policing information on, quote, sexual harassment of and misconduct toward community members, and in particular LGBTQ and gender nonconforming people. Yet the African American Policy Forum Say Her Name report cautions that this is not just a fact of missing numbers, stating that the erasure of Black women and girls is not purely a matter of missing facts. Even where Black women and girls are even present in the data, narratives framing police profiling and lethal force as exclusively male experiences lead researchers, the media, and advocates to exclude them. In many ways, this means structurally accounting for epistemic violence, or what Moya Bailey terms misogynoir, which is how the ways Black women experience violence is tied to and linked to the delegitimization of their experiences across different contexts and institutions. Thus, institutionally, we have to account for the risk associated with reporting. Given the broader legal estrangement of Black populations and the lack of officer accountability, this means seeing Black women's underreporting as a structural problem, not necessarily a personal one, around speaking up, as whenever Black women do report, especially police gender-based and sexual violence, they run a risk of it not being taken seriously and thus incur a risk of officer retaliation. Interpersonally, we also have to account for what Beth Ritchie calls gender entrapment and the trap of loyalty, wherein Black women and girls are socialized into silence or to pursue a politics of respectability as a means of safety, as well as our push to put racial loyalty to the family and community above their own safety and well-being. This is really important because as research on police violence against Black women and girls has shown, and in my own research as well, I found that domestic and familial violence is a critical pathway to Black women's contact with police. And according to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, more than 40% of Black women have experienced some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Thus, as many Black feminists have already argued, we have to account for police encounters outside of the traffic or pedestrian stop, as Black women encounter officers in other settings such as homes, schools, and any other place where officers are present and respond to crises. Individually, we also have to account for the ways women have internalized these broader structures, institutions, and interpersonal processes over the course of their lives. This can lead to many, which I found in my interviews, to downplay their encounters and underreport, and ultimately to doubt their own experiences because they have spent a lifetime and generations not seeing their experiences with police reflected in instruments, talks, medias, or policies aimed at capturing, measuring, and addressing police violence. Altogether, in investigating Black women's invisible experiences, we had to account for these structural, institutional, interpersonal, and individual barriers that delegitimize and negate the ways Black women and girls encounter officers and experience police violence. In doing so, Dr. Yasmin Irizarry at UT Austin and I, my co-author on this part of the project, developed a pre-interview survey that aimed to account for the various ways Black women experience police violence. Drawing on previous research on policing and gender-based and sexual violence, we incorporated measures spanning physical assaults, sexual harassment, and assault and verbal intimidation. With Black women taking this survey before the interviews, I was able to observe their underreporting, is particularly with instruments that were aimed at capturing them, and then probe for the interpersonal, institutional, structural barriers to disclosure. And more, I was able to engage them in an interview around the survey and what could have been improved to better capture their encounters. As I continued talking to more Black women, we adapted the survey as I conducted interviews over the course of several years. And over time, the measures adapted to mirror how Black women were specifically describing and talking about their encounters and the harm they experienced from officers. And in the last set of interviews, Black women explicitly said how they were excited to talk to me because they saw for the first time in their lives their experiences reflected in a survey or something that they felt that legitimized their experiences. And last, we used the measures that we developed over time in a national survey spanning neglect, verbal and psychological abuse, sexual harassment, physical threats and assaults, sexual coercion and assault with Black women ages 18 plus. And today, given the time, I'm going to briefly provide one example in our ongoing research during this process that involved Black women in figuring out how do we capture sexual coercion and assault in our measures. And in Invisible No More in a Shrouded in Silence report, Andrea Ritchie describes how police sexual coercion involves officers using their power to engage in sexual conduct in exchange for leniency or favors. Scholars of policing, and particularly gender-based and sexual violence with police, emphasize institutional power and how officers can draw on these power anytime, regardless of being off duty or on duty. And at this point, I also want to give a warning. I'm going to share a story. And so for those who feel the need to take care of themselves, it's going to be a story of sexual coercion and assault. Gina, a Black middle-class woman in her 30s, specifically talks about this power and her decision to not report when she was sexually assaulted and coerced by police. In our interview, she notes several domestic disputes where she is sexually harassed and assaulted by police. Additionally, she discloses another experience in which an officer sexually assaulted her at a local bar. Out one night with friends, Gina had a domestic dispute with a friend, and the officer was called. The responding officer took advantage of restraining Gina to grope her, saying, quote, "And while he was grabbing me, he was grabbing all up against my body too. I'm like, get off me. I had, of course, a little dress on because I'm going out, and he just grabbed me when we fell to the ground." On the ground, the officer continued groping Gina, putting his hands all over her and describing how he kept touching her all over her body as she yelled for him to stop with no avail. When he finally let her go, he began, quote, acting like it wasn't a thing. He then accused her of being too drunk and telling her that she didn't know what she was talking about. But he would do her a favor by not arresting her. Gina points out that while she was, quote, tipsy, she was coherent enough to know what was going on and that she was being assaulted. Unsure of what to do, Gina left the bar. A few weeks later, Gina saw the officer again, and she tried to ignore him. But he approached her asking, quote, "Weren't you out here a couple of weeks ago showing your ass and stuff?" Angry at how he described the assault, Gina confronted him, replying, "Yeah, but wasn't you grabbing all over my ass?" But this time the officer wasn't alone. He was with his partner, who appeared confused by the verbal exchange. The officer who groped Gina tried to downplay the accusation, pulling her aside, saying, "You know how we get these people out here." Turning back to Gina, he says, "But we don't have to have any problems. I'll make sure I check out for you next time if there's ever something, and make sure I look out for you," offering her protection in exchange for her silence. Gina disclosed the assault to a friend who pushes her to report. But Gina feels uncomfortable reporting and wants to move past it, saying, "I didn't say anything because I was just like, whatever. Sometimes you just let men be men kind of thing, that situation." But she pauses and never finishes her sentence. When I ask Gina how she coped with officers harassing and assaulting her, she responds, "I didn't. I think it was just one of those things you just don't even think about it in the moment, and so you keep pushing." She concludes boys will be boys, and she has no faith in police. More, the department, quote, "ain't going to do nothing about him anyway. They just be like, okay, one person said something." Reflecting on why she and other Black women don't report gender-based and sexual violence from police, she says, "I think that's a lot of time what happens is we just want it to be over. We don't want any problems, so we don't allow reports to be made or extra work to make a statement, because a lot of times we are just trying to get on to the next." Despite claiming that she wants to just move on, Gina sometimes wishes she had reported the assault. She wonders if she could have helped the next Black woman he did this to, because it would have been one of those situations to where I didn't bring it up to say, at least, because then establish a pattern of it. Ultimately, for Gina, reporting still doesn't make sense because he's just going to be out there anyway. The fourth area in our survey, sexual coercion and assault, which includes whether an officer has ever, quote, "told you you would never receive a ticket or citation if you complied to an unwanted sexual act," captures Gina's and other Black women's I interviewed experiences. And I also want to point out that a critical aspect of Gina's story is that interpersonal violence was a critical aspect of how she came into contact with police in the first place and in her other encounters. And Black feminist researchers have pointed to domestic and familial violences like this, explaining how neglect can turn into criminalization, can turn into sexual violence, all within one encounter, stating how the denial of protection is also a form of police violence that increases vulnerability to other forms of violence. Ultimately, we believe that a community-engaged or specific population-engaged methods are best suited for addressing experiences that have been rendered invisible in our data. Understanding that the same processes that render these experiences invisible in the media are the same structures that shape vulnerabilities to violence. Ultimately, we think that policies aiming to address violence in the community should be critical of claims about groups who are not included in conceptualizations of measures of inequality and violence. In many ways, Black women are not the dominant reference group when we think about police violence, and their experiences aren't captured in operationalization measures used in policies and databases. Yet claims are made about their risks from these sources, and policies, particularly police reforms, are constructed around these claims. For example, in my data, I found that community policing models, which have mixed results in terms of lethal violence, made Black women vulnerable to police gender-based and sexual violence and underreporting, as officers knew where they stayed and their daily routines. Reporting in this environment where they knew these harms were not taken seriously meant that they were persistently vulnerable to gender-based and sexual violence, as well as retaliation from community police officers. Second, we argue that if groups are included in these claims, their lived experiences should be centered. In conceptualizing violence in the context of how experiences of violence from officers, this includes then thinking about police contacts in homes, in schools, and the other locations that Black women talked about, malls, the airport, any place where officers were present. This also includes the various ways officers can draw on their power to inflict these harms when they're on and off duty. Next, we argued that we should include and explore the heterogeneity amongst marginalized populations. To to capture the breadth and scope of police violence and other violences, as I found that punishment and violence were rendered invisible through discourses of pathology and privilege, both of which can be used to obscure experiences of violence in Black women's lives. And in conclusion, I want to end with a quote by a Black feminist activist in her 30s who I interviewed talking about the survey. "I am quite sure that women have interactions with police, especially interactions where police put their hands on them. There are many women who can report sexual violence, but we don't. Then domestic violence among police officers is high, but who are you going to call if the police officer is beating you, right? Police violence against Black women is probably, if you were to count the study and to count those numbers altogether, police violence against Black women, whether it's a domestic situation or just in a public space, you got to count those incidents. Black women are probably experiencing horrible, terrifying rates of police violence, but that's not counted. Ultimately, we argue that if we want to build a better world or abolish police, that world should and must include Black women. Not Black women as caregivers in service to other people's protection or other people's right to safety, but Black women as full human beings entitled to safety for themselves. And that means seeing and addressing their lived experiences with police. And thus we argue that an iterative mixed methodological approach that calibrates measures based on how impacted populations describe their lived experiences is uniquely suited for challenging invisibility in the data or documenting violence and inequality on the margins. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. And then we have Rod Martinez, a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Hey.
All right, I'm also going to put the timer on my phone. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about some work that I actually did while I was at the Urban Institute. As of a year ago, I transitioned career paths a little bit, and so I'm now at the Annie Casey Foundation, and I'm going to talk about some of my ongoing investment portfolios there. But I'm actually going to spend most of my time talking about a study I did at the Urban Institute with some really wonderful colleagues. But before then, just want to shout out John. Where's John? Is he gone? Okay. Well, so John was actually, we crossed paths while at the Urban Institute in the middle of this study, and he was a huge source of support. This study required a lot of time, a lot of effort, and had a lot of feelings involved. So John was a big source of support for this study. So the title of my talk is going to be Using PAR to Inform, Reform Policy and Practice as it relates to the anti-violence workforce. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about a group of folks called credible messengers. And so, animation. Okay, so what is a credible messenger? So a few years ago, President Joe Biden actually mentioned credible messengers, and there's a wide growing interest across U.S. cities talking about credible messengers. So credible messengers are people who work with young people, work with young adults, other adults, in an effort to essentially keep them away from systems and also prevent harm, right? So they do a lot of de-escalation, a lot of harm mitigation. And so one of the big aspects of this project that we wanted to tackle was some clarity around what a credible messenger is. It seemed like everybody was using that credible messenger when we actually surveyed a bunch of organizations in New York City about, what is a credible messenger? There was everything from these are uncles, these are family, these are violence interrupters, but we wanted clarity on this definition specifically. And so this is a definition that we came up with of what a credible messenger is. So a credible messenger is typically someone who has had contact with the criminal legal system. Got you. Someone who's had contact with the criminal legal system or indirect contact. That's something that we also learned, that folks also think of people who have not had direct contact themselves, but maybe are family members, had a close friend who's had contact with the legal system. Also people who live in communities that have been criminalized en masse, right? But that's not enough, right? People also talked about the need for these individuals to have transformed their lives, to become community agents of change. Credibility from the community is really important. A lot of times people define credible messengers for their system involvement or contact, but what folks express to us is that that's not what makes us credible messengers. The people, the communities that we serve make us credible, right? And then, people also talked about credible messengers as having some of these soft skills around communication, good listening skills, empathy, and really a deep commitment for community transformation. And I want to read this quote because this is actually how we start the report. We say credible messengers are a bridge between reformists and abolitionists, and they represent an opportunity to vastly reduce our over-reliance on the institutions of policing and other carceral institutions. They also present New York City and other U.S. cities an opportunity to live up to their ideals of justice and remedy some of the injustices of the criminal justice system by centering people most directly impacted in the work of community restoration and healing. And so what I'm actually going to be spending the rest of the time on is a little bit of the background, what our charge was, the methods that we use, a little bit on findings, but then most of the talk is going to be on the recommendations that we put forward. And if I have time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff, the really great projects that we have going on at the Annie Casey Foundation. Okay, so first, as now being in a funder role, I would be remiss to not thank our funders for the study. So we were funded by the New York City Mayor's Office of Economic Development, as well as the Young Men's Initiative. And so the purpose of the study was to understand the current evidence base for the use of credible messengers, so really understanding the efficacy of this workforce. And so to our knowledge and what we found is that there's really not a lot of studies out there looking at credible messengers, particularly whether or not they work, right, which is the big question in the policy world. And so I think we found about 5 studies that had empirically looked at credible messengers. We also wanted to understand where credible messengers come from, right? What are the historical origins of this workforce? A lot of it can be traced to Eddie Ellis, who was a formerly incarcerated Black Panther from Harlem, who started this work with a group of other incarcerated men at a New York State prison. Or at least, that's where most people agree that a lot of the origins are. And then, we wanted to conduct a landscape study to really understand we wanted to be as close to a census to get an understanding of every organization, CBO, every agency, every department that had credible messengers in New York City. And so our goal was to be as inclusive as possible in that. And so we made contact with, I think somewhere over about 30 organizations. But again, I can talk about it later, but it's kind of hard to track some of the work going on. And so specifically what we did was, of course, a literature review. Won't spend a lot of time talking about that. And we enacted a community engaged methods framework, as well as a participatory action research framework, which I'll talk about in a second. And then a cross-program study. We weren't looking at just one program. We wanted to understand the workforce in general in New York City. And then, the last bit of what we did was, of course, dissemination. We wanted this to be public. We wanted to give clarity to the field of practitioners, of policymakers on what this workforce actually does and their perceived impact in New York City. All right. So we employed 2 different types of community engaged methods. One was much more broad in the sense that we engaged key stakeholders from New York City throughout the project. So this included people from the mayor's office, academics, other experts in the field of credible messengers themselves, people who had been served by credible messengers, and we organized them a couple of times throughout the 2-year study so they can provide input in as many things as possible, including our instruments, what we were doing, and they were really essential. A few individuals actually gave us more feedback than others. And then, the biggest part of this project was hiring and training 4 credible messengers as research assistants at the Urban Institute. So at the time, this is actually the first participatory action research project in the history of the Justice Policy Center. So it was a lot of effort. John, you missed it earlier. I was thanking you for all of the support with something like that. And hopefully this doesn't die on me. And so, the way that we train the credible messengers is we develop trainings. We develop workshops for them. One of the extra deliverables that I was able to provide to my funders was actually a training manual on how to train credible messengers in research methods. I think it was like a 100-page document that basically gave them an overview of the Urban Institute, how we do research, timelines, budgets, everything they needed to know, including how to use Box. And so, what was really important to me, and I also realized I'm repeating a lot of what Brooklyn was saying about the need to sustain this past the time of the project. I'm really happy to report that 3 out of the 4 credible messengers went on to do more nerdy research things after the conclusion of the project, including joining.
Sorry about that. I don't want your computer to die.
I don't either. And so what was really important to me also was making sure that these messengers were embedded in the fabric of the Urban Institute, that they weren't just on one project, my project, but that they felt included in the entire organization. And so I was able to finesse professional development time from the Urban Institute and really embed them in staff meetings, to welcome them, but also to provide more opportunities to serve on other projects across the Urban Institute. And so for the actual study, what we did is 3 in-depth organizational case studies of credible messenger organizations in New York City, including Community Connections for Youth. We also surveyed 30 organizational leaders and coordinators across agencies and organizations that employed credible messengers, and then 17 interviews with city officials, stakeholders, including, again, academics, researchers who are in this area. And the content of a lot of the questions and what we were asking about was, some clarity around the term credible messenger and lived experience, the goals and services that they provide, recruitment qualifications, training, perceived impact, challenges, collaboration, and communication. So a few important things that came up. So again, it's really important that we think about, oftentimes people like the idea of credible messengers, but they don't like to think of them as a real workforce that need, good paying jobs and support. And so, we really wanted to understand all of those things. And so, we asked about recruitment and qualifications, including, how do you hire credible messengers? Where do you find them? How do you create a job ad for a credible messenger? It's really awkward to say you want people with criminal convictions, right, for a job. And so, we were really digging into what community credibility meant, what lived experience meant. One of the debates in New York City and something that's ongoing in the field is whether or not there should be whether or not credible messengers should be professionally trained before they actually, are in the field, so to speak, right? So we actually found that was not the case. A lot of people actually went against that and said that we're not social workers, we're not clinicians, and that's what we don't want to be doing here. And so we actually were able to inform a lot of the discourse in New York City around that. We also talked about, the need for, professional development is important, but it should be on the job. Their perceived impact across a lot of organizations and people, right, was that they provide individual and community-wide healing, empowerment, and capacity building. They are often connections between communities, systems, and policymakers. They help us rethink our ideas around public safety, and they bring awareness to systemic and societal forms of oppression. Perceived challenges, obviously the mark of a criminal record is deeply stigmatizing, even in those work environments. Systemic racism, these are mostly Black and Latino men and women, and then capitalism. Low pay and lack of benefits is not something new. Virtually everyone who's done work on credible messengers or violence interrupters will repeat the same thing. There's some funding barriers, workplace challenges, and trauma. All right, so some recommendations is that we increase credible messengers' pay, benefits, and supports. In many cases, credible messengers act as first responders and they're not paid like them. And so that's one of our first recommendations. We also think that there's a need to provide professional development opportunities to improve the way that they work. One of the interesting things that we also find is that they also recommended to us that people with lived experience in the criminal justice system be hired in all roles and fields. A lot of folks were actually tired of being pigeonholed into, if that's a word, into criminal justice. A lot of folks didn't want to do that. And they're constantly being pushed into credible messenger work, but that's not what they wanted to do. And so the other thing is, this is more, a couple of these are more for funders, right? To increase the investments in credible messenger-led organizations versus those more corporate giants that exist in New York City and across the country, and especially community-based organizations that are really embedded in those in communities that they serve. There was some fair amount of collaboration between city agencies and communities, but we recommend, of course, the need for more partners at the table, for funders to allow funding to be used flexibly for capacity building between organizations. So, oftentimes these organizations wanted to do professional development, but they couldn't because of funder restrictions or the scopes of work that they developed. This third one is very specific to New York City. So it took way too long to execute contracts with the city. And this was even a problem for us. And thankfully, the Urban Institute being this giant, we were able to bear the brunt of not being paid so late. But community-based organizations, they couldn't take that burden on of not being paid on time, right? So the process is slow. I did hear back from our funder, and this process is improving in part because of this, and we also gave them some shit at the Urban Institute. So a couple of other things. This is for the researchers. So one of the things that kept coming up was that there's a need to introduce alternate and healing-based forms of evaluation and performance measurement. Folks are really tired of recidivism and levels of violence. And they also talked about the need for more qualitative work here because, you can't possibly capture the amount of labor that goes into this kind of work. Folks are responding at all hours of the night. And so there was a need for researchers to be able to capture that and the complexities of that. And introduce, again, healing has become a big word, but folks are not measuring that. How do you measure that? What is that? We need to do more work there. And then, the last thing is that we ensure that the process of the work drives the structures and processes. And so what that means is that increasingly as more people adopt this as an alternative response or whatever have you, this is becoming diluted. And that there was a real interest in essentially continuing the legacy of Eddie Ellis, the formerly incarcerated Black Panther, and understand that this is a program and philosophy rooted in restorative and transformative justice, not to be diluted, because again, this has turned into McDonald's in many ways in this in the context where everyone's trying to reimagine public safety, but we need to remember the ideals of the actual credible messenger program. All right, so I think that's all the time I have, but I'm sure we'll talk more with Steve's panel, but thank you all.
Wonderful. Okay, and our final panelist is Sophia Block, an undergraduate research scholar at the Justice Policy Lab at the Watson Institute here at Brown University.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. John Eason for allowing me to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Sophia Block. I am a senior graduating in May from Brown, double concentrating in sociology as well as international and public affairs. The presentation that I'm going to give today, conducted under Dr. John Eason and his team of researchers, builds upon the presentation that was given yesterday by Sam and Sarah. On the case studies of prison closures in Blythe and Susanville, California. But my presentation today will build upon this and give a renewed attention to the community-engaged methods that we used in the research process. So to give a brief overview of what I'm going to cover today, first I will start on a bit of background on prison towns, followed by some personal reflections on community-engaged research, a bit on reframing prison abolition itself, and then I'll get into the research purpose, design findings, and then some takeaways that I hope you will all get from this presentation today. So to begin with, as we know, prison towns are often built on invisible land in rural areas. 1 in 4 rural Americans live in a prison town, and the prison boom has gone largely unnoticed as most were built in low-income rural communities of color. So in these rural low-income communities of color, there's a large economic dependence and reliance on prisons in the community. So when these prisons close, there's a lot of community hesitation and fear of economic decline, which leads a lot of residents in these areas to fear for the prosperity of their communities following the prison closures. So before I get into the research design methods and findings, I wanted to talk about positionality and reflexivity, as this was a vital part of our strategy moving forward in working with residents of prison towns that were about to experience or have experienced a prison closure. So students over the past 3 semesters worked in collaboration with city councils and mayors in prison towns in rural California. We had to approach this with an openness to learning and understanding of lived experiences. With this comes along an acknowledgement of power differentials. Students and researchers over the past 3 semesters, we are all students of Brown University, an elite university, speaking with rural communities in California that many of us, including myself, have never been to. I've never been to Blythe or Susanville, which are the case studies for today. Also, we were working with communities of different ideologies. Many student researchers, including myself, identify as abolitionists, prison abolitionists, whereas local governments and community members in Blythe and Susanville approached our research project opposing the prison closure. So as researchers, we have to think, how can we really reconcile the differing research purposes between ourselves, the researchers, and the communities that we're working alongside with? And the solution to this was focusing on curbing prison demand. So while we as researchers want to find economic, sustainable alternatives to prison closures, a lot of people in these communities wanted to utilize our research to propel the movement forward to keep their prisons open rather than focusing on what to do in the face of a prison closure. So my background is on studying wrongful convictions within the criminal legal system under Professor Nicole Gonzalez-Van Cleve, who's sitting over there. So a lot of my research focuses on decarceration and racial inequality in criminalization and incarceration. But for this project, which was outside of my area of expertise, there was a renewed focus on decarceration efforts with attention to the communities that would be most impacted in rural areas. So this was a really big switch that I had to personally examine and thoroughly reflect on in the research process, because in my research, I focus on the criminalization of disability and specifically racism and ableism in policing. So for me to switch from analyzing inequality within the prison system to analyzing inequality within rural America because of prison closures was a big shift that I just wanted to acknowledge in this presentation. And for this work, we really wanted to focus on centering intersectionality of identities. Again, as many people who we spoke to in these prison towns are rural, low-income communities of color, we wanted to focus on their lived experiences and joint collaboration for the betterment of community between ourselves, the researchers, those impacted by the prison closures, and then their local governmental systems. And I wanted to briefly mention how we should reframe prison abolition. So I believe that we cannot advocate for prison closures without considering policy implications and outcomes for prison towns that are primarily lower income communities of color in rural areas. So therefore, we need to reframe prison abolition as a policy and practice, not solely theory. This is not to say that theory is not important, as it is the building blocks of everything I'm going to discuss today, but really just to advance the idea that we need to have a renewed attention to policy and practice and thinking logically about the consequences of prison closures, not merely advocating for prison closures by itself. And I wanted to acknowledge a top-down versus bottom-up approach to policy, meaning that from a top-down perspective, states can decarcerate responsibly. They should decarcerate responsibly, but I'll get into how in these rural towns in California, a lot of residents feel as though the decarceration process was not responsible and without community input. But governments should anticipate consequences and attempt to mitigate these consequences of prison closures through policy. And from a bottom-up from a bottom-up approach, communities can advocate for curbing prison demand by offering prison alternatives. And this is where we came in to work with towns in rural California to say, okay, your prisons are closing. What do you want to better your community and economically sustain your community because of your economic reliance on the prisons? And through the bottom-up approach, we aim to center community voices proactively in decision-making processes and development strategies and ensure community representation and engagement in decision-making spaces. So our purpose, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we wanted to find prison alternatives and curb prison demand in former prison towns to address the impact of closures through centering community voices and utilizing community-engaged approaches. So our case study sites, I know that Sam and Sarah spoke about this yesterday. We spoke with residents of Susanville and Blythe, California. Susanville, their prison closed in June of 2023, and a lot of their residents were fearing economic decline because of their reliance on the prison. And Blythe, California, their prison is supposed to close in March of 2025, and I know a lot of their residents have a lot of pushback against this idea. So we were working with Blythe to really come up with what are some viable alternatives that can sustain Blythe's economy, given that so many people in Blythe work in the prison system and have economic reliance on the prison system. So for our research design, it was mostly a lot of student researchers who worked on this project over the past 3 semesters, and this project is ongoing. We utilized a mixed methods approach. I'll mainly focus on the qualitative aspect of this, but I wanted to acknowledge that there is simultaneously, along with this community-engaged research, qualitative data, there is a quantitative team that is working to analyze how prison closures impact 7 variables in census data, including the population, percent of supplemental security income recipients, food insecurity, Medicaid beneficiaries, poverty rate, unemployment, and total impoverishment rate. But again, I'm going to focus on the community engaged portion of this. So we were going to meet with community members in former and future prison towns to understand the town's deep and complex history and reliance on the prison through semi-structured interviews. And through this, it was important that we, as students, as researchers of products of Brown University, treat Blythe and Susanville as unique towns with different and specialized wants and needs. So we did not want to generalize what Susanville wanted to Blythe or vice versa. We wanted to acknowledge each prison town as its own entity and really listen to community members and what they wanted to see transform in their town following the prison closures. And then in terms of our dissemination approach, we were going to present findings to governmental bodies, including the city council and the mayor in Blythe and Susanville. And this was open to community members. We really wanted to ensure that in our dissemination process, community members felt as though their voices were heard and as though we were amplifying their voices, not pushing any sort of external agenda. We were merely meeting with them and synthesizing their ideas for their town moving forward. And we wanted to make sure that they had access to these disseminated results. So in terms of qualitative findings, interviewees from Blythe and Susanville both emphasized the fear that prison closures will be associated with decline in businesses, local schools, and et cetera. In terms of social movements, we found that in talking with residents of Blythe and Susanville, in both prison towns, there were oppositional movements to the prison closure. In Susanville, there was the Save CCC campaign, which is the California Correctional Center, and in Blythe, there was the Save Chuckawalla Valley State Prison campaign. So, as we can see, it was very difficult to reconcile how we as researchers were feeling about the prison closures and how that would ameliorate inequality within prisons with how these rural communities of color were dealing with the prison closure and how it would impact their daily life. So these oppositional movements spurred because of that. And in terms of responsible decarceration efforts, community members felt as though they didn't have a say in the closure decision or the process. So a lot of them felt as though they were blindsided and that reactions to the prison closure should have been proactive, but instead were reactionary. And I wanted to briefly read this quote that illustrates how community members felt as though the prison closure warranted a reactionary response rather than proactive measures. And they felt as though the government completely blindsided them and was not responsibly decarcerating from a top-down perspective. So this is from a business owner and educator, a resident of Blythe for over 45 years. The overarching issue is and continues to be the fact that we are reacting to this rather than having the opportunity from the beginning to be proactive with regard to the decisions being made. And I think that's a complete injustice to our community and to the prison system, to, the employees and even the inmates. I mean, they have rights too, and they have families too, and they have, limited resources just like this town does. And I think that having that carpet pulled out from under them, I think that being reactive instead of having the opportunity to be proactive from the beginning was not good. With that being said, with acknowledging that people in the town were not happy about the prison closures, I wanted to also acknowledge a false dichotomy. So what abolitionists know in the abolitionist space is that there are racial inequalities within prison. Obviously, we know this. And what abolitionists are currently learning is how prison closures can exacerbate inequality for rural towns. What I offer to this conversation is an acknowledgement that we have to work towards ameliorating inequality inside and outside of prisons simultaneously. You can't have one without the other. And in Blythe, I wanted to go over some of our preliminary findings. We wanted to amplify community members' perspectives as experts in the well-being of their own town. So in asking them about repurposing the prison, solutions were offered such as warehouses, renewable energy centers, data centers, and in terms of alternative development strategies, they alluded to investing in natural resources and tourism, investing in public health, renewable energy, utilizing the airport. And as some key takeaways from this presentation, I just wanted to ensure that I've added something to the conversation in abolitionist spaces. As states shift towards decarceration efforts, we need to be mindful of how rural communities can be effective leaders in curbing prison demand. We need to imagine the potential in rural communities of color and acknowledge our relative power as researchers as we embark on research processes in collaboration with these rural communities. We know that systems of racialized violence and state control exacerbate racial inequality in prisons, and while attempting to mitigate this racial inequality within prisons, states often exacerbate rural inequality. However, we can ameliorate inequality inside and outside of prisons simultaneously through responsible decarceration efforts and community input in curbing prison demand. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. This was a really exciting panel. I've learned so much. So I want to start by zooming out and thinking a little bit about methods first before zooming back into the panel. So this is a really exciting time for new methods, or not always new methods, but methods that have been around a while but are starting to really infiltrate into criminology and punishment society, and basically become increasingly mainstream. So just a couple of examples of some exciting things happening kind of in the fields that I'm in. We're seeing the rise of poetry as method. So I don't see, where's Monica Bell? So Monica Bell is doing empirical poetry. A colleague at Delaware, Santhi Leone is doing I poetry or I poems. We're seeing the incorporation of authors writing fiction as part of their research products. So incorporating fiction based on their research, like Fergus McNeill. We're seeing the increasing incorporation of first person and lived experience, again in the publication, as with Reuben Miller, which I don't also see, but I can't see very well, my eyesight and all that. I'm seeing more people drawing on creative confabulation from Saidiya Hartman. Photo voice with Susila, Susila Gurusamy is using. Something I'm not seeing as much of, but there's a lot of resonance to a lot of these methods, and what we're hearing today is also indigenous methods, or depending on your preference, First Nations, Native peoples, such as the work by Linda Smith and others working in decolonizing methods, again with a lot of parallels to what we're hearing. So I wanted to think a little bit about some of the there are plenty of benefits. I'm going to skip over the benefits, but also just I'm going to talk about both the benefits and the limitations of using new methods, and just kind of think about this a little practically, and kind of big picture again. So traditionally, when we're focusing on what methods we use, we often focus on a couple of priorities, but one kind of the most central one traditionally that we focus on is essentially for data collection, what's going to get us the best data on the target of our research question. That's usually the central thing. So we always say, pick the method that helps with your research question. But then kind of secondary traditional concerns are also like what's available, like what can I actually get access to, what's realistic, and then of course ethics, which is a huge branch of considerations of like what's ethically doable, what should I do, when should I not do certain research. But increasingly, we're starting to focus more on other considerations that historically weren't forefront a lot of times in our minds, or at least in like mainstream research. And so some of these considerations are things like, what gets us access? That's something that traditionally ethnographers were better at doing, but I think this is also something that we're starting to think more seriously about. What lets us essentially collect and present data in ways that are essentially truer to the people that we're studying, our participants, what lets us kind of, protect their voice and elevate their voice and, basically not dilute it or, mess it up too much with our like science-y approach. Also, increasingly, we're thinking about what's most effective for our audience. So whether we're talking about policymakers or voters or students or activists or the communities that we're studying as well. So what's actually going to speak most to these different groups, and those, might be different answers. So sometimes we think about what's going to be the most powerful and evocative, and qualitative methods tends to be really good at this, like getting those stories where like, it's a gut punch to hear those. Or alternatively, we think about like what's most persuasive and legitimate. So especially for policy circles, this tends to be quantitative methods. Then, of course, there are career considerations. What can get published? Doing new methods is kind of difficult. Getting people to sign off on something that's not familiar is very challenging. And also what allows career advancement. There are different biases against different types of methods, and so that's also a consideration. And then another one that's kind of increasingly over the last like 5 or so years is transparency on data publication. So, we're under increasing pressure, even for qualitative research, to publish our research, our data, not just our research, but our data in ways that also has considerations for the privacy of the folks that we're studying, and then can, in turn affect access issues and things like that. So these are some like big picture things that that I was kind of thinking about in the background. But I want to turn back to this to the panel and these wonderful talks. And Sophia kind of scooped me on a couple of the things that I was going to say, or some of the questions that I was going to ask. But I want to come back to the question of limitations, and kind of thinking about this both from the stance of yes, as social science, but also just practically like thinking about this in terms of advice for future researchers who want to replicate these methods. Not replicate as in like I want to replicate your findings, but like I want to do this too. Like how do I do that? What are some considerations? So I want to ask the panelists, and feel free to answer or not answer, but just a couple of questions for the group. So what sorts of like obstacles that you face? Like you've shown us these wonderful studies, like so exciting, but I didn't hear so much about like where did things go wrong? Like what are so like for somebody who wants to go out and do these things, like what advice would you offer? Like what sort of obstacles did you run into? Barriers did you run into? Things that like went wrong? So I'm especially interested, again, thinking about Monica Bell's research, for example. Thank you. Like, do you run into people who either on the one hand don't want to participate in your study, like this is always a consideration, but especially I'm curious for participatory action research, but especially do you have people like especially with the team-based research where the community members are part of your research team, do you run into issues where people need anonymity or like it's actually dangerous for them to participate in your research, or they you want to give them credit but you can't because it would somehow put them at greater risk, like if they're on parole, if you have people who are currently incarcerated, or if you have people who are dealing with police violence, like, what sorts of obstacles do you run into to even just getting people to participate, and how to do it in a way that like respects their dignity, their autonomy, their safety, and all that, while also, abiding by like IRB and all of those things. I was also thinking about like, what are some of the obstacles we can think about as a field for when people want to scale up and do this like more people are going to do this. And one of the things I worry about when like methods go mainstream is like they do get diluted. They do get, like people are not always as thoughtful about doing this work. And so what are some of the things that, you can anticipate? And related to that, I was going to ask about positionality and what are some of the issues that come up. So when you're studying people who are of a different class, race, background, or history or status, people who have different preferences, different politics than you, and thinking about the power dynamics at play. So I like how participatory action research has the the potential, as Dr. Hitchens was saying, to reduce some of those extractive natures of research, but at the same time, they're still there, and it's also going to look different in different communities and with different researchers, and so kind of thinking about those sorts of issues. And then, sorry, I'm just trying to read my notes here. Right, and then another question that I've actually been kind of thinking about, thank you, with the last couple of days yesterday and today, is, Sophia, you brought this up in your study. What happens when you go into the field and you have different goals than your participants? And this is something that I think we sometimes see with even things like defund the police or abolish prisons in communities where you go in expecting people to be on the same page, but actually it's more complicated than that. That's not necessarily what people want. And so kind of thinking about, thinking about obstacles, what happens when what you expect to find is not what you find, or what you expect people to think is not what you think, and how to adjust in a way that's, true to one, the data, and two, to what your participants want. Sometimes in ways that are kind of uncomfortable, and sometimes in ways that are like, oh, wow, that really makes me think. That's really interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Either you guys can respond, or you can just turn to questions. It's totally up to you.
I can respond. What I'll say as a challenge is, I won't just attribute this to the Urban Institute or any of the other organizations I've been a part of, but there's a really basic challenge around putting formerly incarcerated people with system contact in white-collar work environments. I haven't quite articulated what that cultural piece is, but there is, and I say that as a first-generation professional as well, it takes years and years to learn. Some of you have talked about the hidden curriculum, learn how to handle yourself professionally in the non-white supremacist way, right? A lot of really basic things, like how to organize your work in this environment where you're not being supervised so closely, right? White collar work environments are. And so, I've had that now working with some of our grantees who place system impacted young people in these professional opportunities, which is really great. But sometimes they run into challenges around they're not showing up to meetings. It must mean that they don't care. And I'm no, it just, they have a lot of stuff going on, and on top of it, it takes a while to understand that not everybody lives their life through Outlook.
Wow.
And
yes.
so it just, yes. But people get really frustrated and sometimes very upset because they take it personally that these young people aren't, on top of young folks have a different idea of work these days, but and so that becomes a huge challenge, and I think it's a tension, right? Also expose them to people who come from different racial groups, different class backgrounds is also, and I could talk about a bunch of stories related to that, but yeah, I think that's a big issue. But something that I brought up to John's students a few weeks ago was also you need to understand your institution's policies around different things, because it varies. The challenges can vary according to institution. For example, me and my co-PI were actually freaking out about hiring people with criminal convictions. We're the Urban Institute is going to have all types of stuff to say and barriers, and it turns out they don't have educational requirements to apply to the Urban Institute. And I was wow, that wasn't even a problem, right? But you really have to understand your institution's policies.
Okay, I can go next. There are a ton of obstacles, right? There are a ton. The big one is funding, right? So how I view funding now as a tenure track professor is different than how I viewed it as a graduate student. And so I think it's important to recognize that the funding will look different at different stages in your career. And I think that scaling up as a field requires us to be intentional about where we are in our career, right? So how I look at funding or scaling up PAR looks differently now. Now I have, a little bit more access to money and things of that nature than I did when I was a graduate student. Other obstacles, it's a very tenuous relationship when you're working with community-based orgs and nonprofits, right? So any small thing, given the legacy of mistrust of, universities and research more generally, any small thing can ruin the relationship, right? And I've seen that firsthand. Like a small HR issue that someone might see as benign, right, can literally ruin your access to a population. And so, thinking about that on the front end, but also getting everyone that you're working with on code about how, how things should go or not go in the community is important. And to be honest with you, as it relates to positionality, I think sometimes if you're working with a community that knows you or you're the same racial ethnic group as those folks, it's sometimes harder, right? Because the standards are higher. They're expecting you to come into their community with a level of fidelity and all the things. So I would argue that sometimes our work is actually harder. Anonymity, we ask folks, right, whether they want to use pseudonyms. And surprisingly, a lot of people don't want to use them. They want their voices to be heard. They want their names to be in the books. They want people to hear their voices. Interestingly, you have to double check that too, because sometimes once you see the product, you might not be happy with it, or you might want something changed. So I think it's important to keep that line of communication open with your participants. And then the extractive nature. I think we try to be really upfront with folks. The reality is this: as academics, we will get more out of this than the people that we often study, right? And I think that's an uncomfortable truth, but it's true. And I think we need to be honest about that with our participants and do our due diligence to make sure we're getting the funding and we're funneling it to the people that need it, giving them the resources so that they can be upwardly mobile, but being real about the ways in which we will benefit from it. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I was going to say two things. One, in terms of obstacles, particularly in terms of my project, the obstacles came more from academia, especially at the beginning of the project. So I think when you're investigating marginalized topics or invisible experiences, and particularly if you're a graduate student doing that versus a faculty member, those come from the gatekeepers from within. And for me, within my project, it was like, if the experience is invisible, there wasn't a lot of reflexivity around then how now am I oppressing the knowledge production around that experience. So saying questions like, well, Black women don't experience police violence because we don't have any reports on it, which one isn't true, but two, that's part of the question and the process, or making assumptions about Black middle-class women's experiences of police or other types of violences. So I think in terms of, for junior scholars particularly, I think for me, finding a group of people who were supportive of that work, who had a politics that I shared, whether they were inside the academy or not, or other institutions. I'm looking out at a bunch of people here who have been like super important to my process. It was really important for when you go in there and people basically do the process of making it invisible on you as you're trying to do that type of work. And then in terms of positionality, I think just bluntly, we aren't entitled to people's stories. So a no is a no, and that's okay. I don't think a no means sometimes we need to figure out how to get at the story. I think it just means we respect the no, and they will share their story with whom they want to, and then we have to figure out what we want to do next. And so I think for me, in terms of my positionality, I don't know if I would have been able to do my project if I also didn't identify or wasn't a Black woman. Because I had participants stay in their car and wait till the researcher showed up and was like, I'm waiting for you. Or I wouldn't have talked to someone about this experience because they wouldn't have understood. And I think, again, instead of seeing that as like a schism in the research process and more of like histories and legacies of epistemic violence, I think it just means some people are better suited based on their position. We always term me-search, I think particularly for scholars of color, as like a negative, when actually it's a resource when we come from those communities and share those experiences.
And I'll also add to the conversation just by saying for the research that I was a part of, I was a team of 20 or so student researchers coming from all different places, all different backgrounds and phases of life. And speaking with rural communities of color in California, it was just something that we were constantly thinking about our positionality and reflexivity in the research process. And we did have a standardized set of questions in our semi-structured interview protocol, and I think that really helped in analyzing our positionality, but also trying to standardize what we were trying to learn from participants. And I'll also say that in the research process and reaching out to community members, we had sometimes like a 10% response rate, and that's just what it is, and that's okay. Some people would love their stories to be heard, others want to be anonymized, others don't want to share their stories, and that's completely okay. But with that, we have to acknowledge that the people who are willing to speak with us and want their stories told may not be representative of all of the community members. A lot of people who we spoke with in Susanville and Blythe were very, very opposed to the prison closure, and that may be reflective of the community at large, but that was definitely reflective of the small sample size that we had, which was another variable, the very, very small sample size that I hope was indicative of the community that we were trying to represent.
Okay, so we have time for 2 questions, so why don't we go ahead and take 2, or...
Actually,
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna hop in because we have questions online. They were coming in real slow yesterday. So we actually have some online. So the folks here can probably catch you guys during the break. We're gonna take in a couple of minutes. But from online, we have, for Brooklyn, what's the parameters of quote unquote success you used? Were and how those parameters, how and what were the parameters, and how were those parameters determined, right? What were they and how were they determined for success? Then for Rod, was there peer-to-peer credible messenger training? Meaning did the folks with actual lived experience train folks since their expertise is invaluable? She probably put on my reading glasses. Sorry about that. Any advice, and then for Brooklyn again, there was any advice on how university collaborations can foster more CEM participatory research, given the IRB challenges and everything else, right? And lastly, for Sophia, can you talk a little more about your experience transitioning from, or I think that other question wasn't for Brooklyn, that may have been for you, Shannon.
Oh.
And I think you sort of addressed some of it already.
Can you
but
repeat?
Sorry about that. You were like, this isn't. My bad. Any advice, I think you spoke to this a little bit, but you can speak to it a little bit more. Any advice on how university collaborations can foster more community engaged participatory research, given IRB challenges and everything else? You spoke to this a little bit, but you can speak on it a little bit more. And lastly, for Sophia, can you talk a little more about your experience transitioning from disability inequality to decarceration? Like, I think they're thinking about your positionality in particular. So, thank you all. And you all have a minute each to answer these questions. Is that cool? In no particular order, whoever wants to go first can go.
I'll be quick because I'll take less than a minute because I love questions. Parameters of success. So success is ongoing, right? It's an iterative process. I think we look at success at different levels. So we look at the actual PAR team. To what extent are we helping folks transition after the PAR project into upward mobility? So are we enrolling them in school? Are they able to then get a job? Maybe if they don't want to work in the credible messenger model after PAR, are they able to move into another type of job that they value, right? Are we publishing with them, right? That part is a really strong marker of success, and we have a pretty good track record of that. As it relates to data collection, success in data collection, I mean, that's iterative as well. We pride ourselves on getting these large samples of folks who otherwise wouldn't be involved in research at all. And so we look at that from each step. So are we able to get folks to come out and line up to take the survey or to sit for an interview? And then the fallout steps, of collaborating, of analyzing, and publishing. So long story short, we spend a lot of time in the communities that we serve, and that has benefits as well. And we see that as a measure of success because people want us to be there, right? So I think that matters as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll talk about, I think, collaboration IRB challenges. I think one of the things when I think about the IRB in terms of protecting human subjects, I think the priority really is protecting the institution from liability. And so I think in terms of some of those challenges, talking about any experience of violence, the institution is more invested in how, if any blowback comes from this, how will that impact us as an institution? but I'm going to center the question a little bit on safety. And so I think in terms of thinking about safety for participants, not relying on the IRB, actually, I think is super important to dictate your practices of safety, actually relying on the community, relying on the Black women. And that was different for each Black woman. Again, there's some blanket things in terms of anonymity, using pseudonyms. But for some of them, particularly those who had closer contact with police, or ongoing contact with police, we had conversations about what they needed in terms of to feel safe, not only after publication, but also during the interview. So I think a lot of things we're trying to figure out, but explicitly asking people how they would want to approach it, I think is just really important.
So, the answer is yes. There is mutual training going on at all times with credible messengers, training other credible messengers. The Credible Messenger Justice Center in New York City is probably the most well-known, where that's led by credible messengers who train other credible messengers in the philosophy and teachings of the approach.
And I'll say in regard to my question, over the last year, I've pursued an independent research project for my senior thesis on the intersection of racism and ableism in the carceral state and in policing specifically. So I interviewed parents of children who have been diagnosed with so-called invisible disabilities such as ADHD and autism. And in asking these parents, I really want to understand, how do they prepare their children to interact with police, and does this vary by race of the parent or of the child? So in looking at that is really my background as a researcher. I have a strong background in wrongful convictions. I worked for the Innocence Project. So coming into this space and focusing on decarceration kind of seemed like the next natural step. With this being said, I have a lot easier of a time sympathizing with decarceration for those who are incarcerated than rural communities that are affected by decarceration. So it was a challenge for me to really see the other side of decarceration, which is an important perspective that must be heard and we must acknowledge. But again, this was new to me stepping into this research position, just in valuing different perspectives and acknowledging that we can have both. We can responsibly decarcerate and curb prison demand, while increasing inequality for those who are incarcerated, while decreasing inequality for those who are incarcerated, as well as decreasing equality for those who are impacted in rural communities. So it was a bit of a challenge for me transitioning, but I'd say that my background in disability studies and in acknowledging the system of racism and ableism that's woven into the fabric of our nation, it's really impactful and really sets the stage for me entering the decarceration space. So I'd say my background was an asset in that respect.
So I believe we're out of time, so please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.